Are we ready?
Mhm.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, good morning. Well, that just didn't work out well, did it? Excuse me, I'm so used to saying good morning. Well, good evening, everyone. Well, that didn't work out too well.
Part of your blooper.
It was a blooper, definitely a blooper. Thank you for everyone for giving us their time this evening. I'm really excited to share a wine with everyone and to discuss a very important element in the paediatric field, especially with screen time. It's such a confusing area for many parents and health professionals with what healthy decisions are best around screen time, what are the recommendations, and what is the best research that's out there in regards to the topic. So to get started, I will just have a chat with Dr. Mary. Thank you, Dr. Mary, for coming on this evening. I wanted to touch base with the research study that everyone's been talking about the last week. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, baby.
Thanks so much for having me. So our recent study was published last Tuesday. Gosh, it feels like forever ago already. It's been a lot going on, but so our study was a longitudinal study. We tracked 220 Australian families during their early years of life to try and understand what their early language experiences were like, as well as how much screen time they were being exposed to. And the way we did this was through advanced speech recognition technology, which is called Lena. I don't know if anyone has come across it before, but essentially it's like kind of like a Fitbit, but instead of counting the number of steps you take, this device could count the number of words that children heard and spoke over the course of a day. And it could also tell us how much electronic noise the child was being exposed to. However, we didn't know if this electronic noise was actually screen related, or it could have been things like a microwave beeping in the background. So what we actually did is originally our focus of the study wasn't actually screen time. It was purely focused on the children's early language. But the more we spoke to families as well as early childhood and screen time, and as you all know, it's such a big challenge for families right now. So we ended up going back to the families that had participated in the study and asked for their consent for us to listen to those parts of the audio that was recorded where it flagged electronic noise. And so our team ended up listening to over 7,000 hours of audio to code whether or not it was screen time or other electronic sounds. And so once we had all of that information, we looked at the results and we analyzed the data, and what we showed was that for increases in screen time, it was leading to decreases in the amount of adult words that children heard, the amount of vocalizations that children were saying themselves. So because we had children from ages 12 months through to 36 months, they're only vocalizing when they're younger, and then obviously that turns into words as they get older. And that we were also seeing fewer back and forth interactions with the parent too.
And so in terms of the language, were you looking at specific age groups, like from 0 to 12, 8, and then 18 months to 36 months, or were you looking at between 0 to 5 years of age?
So the overall study was from 0 to 5 years of age. We followed children once every 6 months, starting when they were 6 months. And this particular study that was published last week is reporting on findings from when the children were 12, 18, 24, 30, and 36 months. So that kind of 1 to 3 year age group.
As I was reading the research article, I was actually quite interested with a quote that really stood out, that for an 18-month-old, each minute of screen time that was associated with the child hearing, they heard significantly fewer words, vocalizations, and reduced conversation exchanged. Now, can you just dig deeper into the quantity of that and the impact of that for an 18-month-old?
Yeah, sure. So you're going to test me now on the 18-month.
Just generally with that, yeah.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I do know that for the 3-year-olds, for example, they were the most profound findings, I guess. Where we saw for 1 minute of screen time, it was leading to 7 fewer adult words. The children were saying 5 fewer words themselves, and engaging in 1 less conversation back and forth. we really did see kind of like a gradual increase from 18 months onwards. So while the 18 months was slightly less than that, it was still, as you said, Rita, a significant decrease in words, vocalizations, and conversations. But, you know, that was for just 1 minute of screen time. So when we actually looked at our data, the average 3-year-old in our study was being exposed to just under 3 hours of screen time. And so when we looked at that for the average child, what we found was that children could be missing out on, you know, approximately 1,100 adult words every day. They were saying roughly, I think it was 800 fewer words themselves, and missing out on just under 200 back and forth interactions. And so, you know, as everyone here knows, and can probably honestly talk about it more than I can, having that language rich home environment with lots of talking and lots of interaction, we know is so important when it comes to their early language development. And so our study has highlighted that screen time might be one of those things getting in the way of that hopefully is one of those things that we can, you know, modify in different ways to help support families to add in those extra words and interactions with their young children.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I apologize for not introducing the panel earlier. I just got caught up with accepting everyone on, but I have Sarah from Bambini Health and Maria from Move, Grow and Play OT. They're both OTs, and Carla, a childcare educator, and Julia Sexton from Talk HQ, another speech pathologist based in Queensland. Now, Jules, you might relate with what I'm about to say, that hearing all this content about the quantity of language missed is quite profound. Like we say, yes, okay, it's really important to reduce screen time and increase interactions with your child. But when you actually hear how many words a child is missing, it makes you wonder what we need to possibly do with our intervention and how much support parents need with making better decisions around screen times as well. Jules, did you want to pitch into that?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Mary, for your research, because it's definitely things that we're seeing in practice, but it's nice to actually have the research to back us up. And I think that this is a real opportunity to make sure that we're doing the holistic practice. And it's not just looking at, you know, showing parents the strategies of how to, you know, get more language interaction. It's even those practical things of how can we foster that environment that's going to create more, which for me, a big part is those practical solutions or practical habits. Like, for example, like I've got 4 kids. And so one thing when we used to, you know, go visiting and stuff like that, our friends didn't have children, so they wouldn't have anything to play with when we went there. But I'm very thankful that I had I suppose the background about the importance of play. And so it was just a simple thing that I had a toy bag that was in the car, and it was only there to play with when we visited friends. So it was like Christmas when we would visit, because they felt like they were getting new toys. And then the same thing, like whatever those toys were, they changed. So as they get older, you know, it went from those bulkier toys to, you know, card games and things like that. So I just think that that's a really important thing for, you know, other therapists. It's not just, you know, don't have a screen for your child. It's more of what's practical and how can we just, maybe adapt or amend one thing at a time. Because I know we were speaking about this, Rita, that we've all fallen into that trap where, you know, sometimes it's just easier to give them the kids the screen, and I've definitely fallen into that. And it's only every now and then that you sort of pull yourself up and you go, no, that's not okay, and we need to do that. So it's lovely when you see that research to show it, because I think the other big thing that was screaming from your research, Dr. Mary, was it's not only the quantity of the words, like we know that part is really important, but then when it's getting to that 3-year-old stage, it's the quality of the words. So if the quantity is not there, they're not necessarily going to be exposed to the more, you know, mature vocabulary, which we know is directly linked to reading comprehension. So it sort of has this cascade effect onto even reading and writing and things like that. So yeah, it's really, really fantastic to have these numbers to be able to share with the families and provide really practical solutions.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that also stood out to me is the communication exchange. And then we know the importance of turn taking and how vital that is for pre-verbal development too. I wanted to ask Dr. Mary, when you say screens, the concept is so large. Are we referring to iPads, parent phones, or actual televisions? How did you control the study? Because as a mum myself, it's hard. Like, hands up, it's really, really challenging to work, do housework as well without 3 children around my knee saying, mum, 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 all the time. And it's honestly so refreshing sometimes just to have an educational television show or a movie just to give me that respite to just play catch up. And I know so many parents relate to that concept of playing catch up. But from your study, what was a healthier choice of a screen time that you found, or what screens did you employ in your study?
So I'll answer sort of both questions that you have. First, in terms of our study, we looked at all different types of screen time. So I know this is probably a bit of a controversial way that we've done it. Like, lots of people have lots of different opinions when it comes to like what screen time actually is. And in our study, framed it more as screen exposure, because it was essentially any time the child was exposed to any screen device. And that was for sort of 2 reasons. We wanted to understand the family screen exposure, because if you think about it, and we're thinking about this idea of screens sort of getting in the way of those communications, you know, that could be because the parent's distracted on their screen as well as the child being distracted by a screen. So we did want to capture as many different types as possible. We were also reliant on just having the audio cues through the technology. So, you know, we didn't have a video camera in the home, so we couldn't always capture some of that, you know, silent screen time that might be going on, especially around the parents' phone use. You know, for children this age, generally speaking, the screen time is almost always going to be with some sort of noise on so that they can interact with it. And we, you know, could still pick up kind of cues around the child. So often we, you know, could work out that they were on a screen because they'd be asking for their iPad, or the parent would be talking about the TV being on in the background. So we were able to kind of tease some of that apart. But yeah, we did include all different types of screen time. And that was even, say, if we could tell that the child was maybe doing something else in the same room with the parent, but the TV was on in the background, we would still include that as screen time. And one of the reasons for that is that we do also know from the research, for very young children, especially, they do find it hard to, I guess, switch task focus between 2 different things. So, you know, even if as a parent, you might think you're reading with your child, or, you know, you're cooking dinner with them or something, but the TV's on in the background, they're still going to be distracted by those, you know, flashy lights and sequences and the sounds. And so they're probably not necessarily getting the benefit of either things, either, you know, the potential benefit from the screen or whatever activity you're doing. So in terms of, you know, your second question about kind of what healthier screen like, I really try and avoid providing parents with any sort of strict time limits, because I know every family looks so different. And as you were touching on, you know, screen time is a really fantastic tool for parent respite. You know, we need to be best versions of ourselves with our kids, and sometimes that means being able to take a little break, and screen time is something that can give you that break where you know your child is going to be safe, you know, physically safe. And so that can be really important. But you know, one of the tips that we give is, if no one is watching the TV or the screen, you know, just turn it off. And if you're wanting noise in the background, maybe opting for music or something instead. If you are choosing to use screens with your young children, we'd recommend choosing some of that educational content. So looking for high quality educational shows that are age appropriate, where they're specifically designed in a way where they can actually help kind of facilitate some of that language development. There has been early studies that have showed when children are watching high quality content, and that might be things like, you know, Sesame Street, Play School, it has actually led to improvements in their vocabulary and their early language development. I would say that field is still quite early, and there's lots of limitations with those studies, but it is promising to kind of see some of those results. One of the other big things that we really try and encourage where possible is doing something called interactive co-viewing. So that's where the parent is sort of sitting there with the child while the screen's on and trying to use the screen to facilitate some of that extra language. So that might be things like singing along to your child's favorite theme song, or repeating words and phrases from the screen so that you've got that kind of real life conversation and it being reinforced in the child's everyday life. It might even look like taking something that your child watched on the TV and then turning that into a game after the screen gets turned off, or chatting to them about their favorite character and kind of using it as a bonding experience. So there is, some ways that we can kind of make screen time a bit healthier without, having this blanket rule of no screen time. Obviously, each to their own. And, we talk to a lot of parents who do flat out have no screen time, and that's amazing too. But we're just trying to give options that are evidence-based for as many family situations as possible.
I really like how you touched base on that, because I feel parents feel a lot of guilt for putting the screen time and putting their needs first sometimes for that respite. And I love how you've actually said we know that this happens. This is the reality of the world that we live in, especially after COVID. So let's take our reality and let's shape it in a way that's optimistic and really supports positive changes. And I do this with my clients, where you talk about the interactive element. If a child's watching, I don't know, Miss Rachel or Wiggles, how about you have a joint interaction? And Jules, you can touch base on this, that joint play and joint interaction with another communication partner definitely facilitates that early language development and early rapport building and bonding with the young ones too. Jules, did you want? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that joint attention is so important in terms of that development. So if your child is super interested in one particular thing, like whether it's Bluey or whatever, but that's the way that you're achieving, the joint attention, fantastic. And then how can we then perhaps shape it into, play and things like that using the Bluey figures and stuff. So it's definitely, it's got its place, I feel, and it's the reality. And then it's just now that we're aware of the impact of perhaps a healthy way of using screen time, and how that then can really set your child up for life. I think that's really good.
And it's really important to understand the quality of your interactions with your child, that you can play and you can go shopping and cook together, but the reality is the screens are always available. So let's incorporate the two so it's a fun, interactive moment. Now I'm going to put the floor to the other allied health team and to Carla, who's a childcare educator. Did you want to pitch your perspective from an OT, occupational therapy point of view? And Carla from child educator.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on it. I think we've all been in situations where we've probably sort of judged the family next to you with the kids on the iPad at the restaurant and said, I'm never going to do that. But the reality is there are moments that are really hard, when you're working or running business or trying to get just general household things done. So coming from an OT, we understand the value of all occupations and getting things done, but it's also equally important to touch on the impact it has, not just on language, but on social emotional development, on your capacity to co-regulate with your child and model to them just important life skills. So and Sarah, I don't know if you want to jump in here too, and the other impacts that excessive screen time can have.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about is, for me, I'm DAR floor time trained, and part of the assessment when a family comes in is actually an observation of the interaction between the parent and the child. You actually essentially score the child on their capacity levels, and then you actually score the parent. And the reason why you do that is because you're trying to determine, is there a match in play capabilities and skills, or is the parent struggling with some of those play themes for maybe that child that is really relying on sensory motor play. Is this parent trying to facilitate a play that's beyond that capacity that might be resulting in some challenges in that joint attention and connection? And often when I speak to parents that are struggling with the play, which we know as adults, it is hard to know how to play unless you're working in pediatrics. It's not something that feels necessarily comfortable and natural. And a lot of the conversation is parents that will say to me, well, I don't typically play with my child. I usually watch a movie with them, or I watch their favorite TV show and we lay together and that's our moment, but we don't necessarily play together. And then when you start to, and I guess then in that time, you want to give that advice and say, well, actually, we kind of need other types of play interactions, and then giving those functional strategies of, well, maybe we can use some of that to facilitate that connection. And you want to, at the time, use research to back that up. And I think then we didn't feel like we had all of the research there to be able to use that evidence to support what we're saying. And again, as everybody's been saying, parents often do feel so judged. And so for us, it can be nerve-wracking when we come in without evidence, because if we do, then it does sound like we're judging. Whereas if we say what the research says is this, I feel that families will really accept that on a different level.
I'll add something in there. So I facilitate many parent and baby classes, and I'm running some classes at the moment. And you're right, some of the parents don't actually know how to play with their child. So I have to sit there and explain, come down on their level, pop them in front of you and do this, this, and that. And they're just like, oh, wow, is that all I need to do? And it's like, yeah, it's not rocket science, So as an early childhood educator and a specialist and a business owner, I've just seen that come along over the last few years. And it's just really interesting to see. It's, like I said, simple activities, and the parents just don't know what to do. So that's my role. I simply just guide them in simple things, colors, shapes, textures, everything we're doing in that class of a 45-minute class. That child is benefiting with you, with the bonding, with the socialization of other children around them. And you just hear all the little babble sounds from the under 12 months to the 36 months. It's just, it's beautiful to see. But like I said, it's just engaging with those parents and telling them this is what you need to do. So it's really interesting.
I wanted to add to what you were saying about some of the baby sensory sort of classes as well. And a really experienced OT that I know said to me that when he took his children, it felt like sensory bombardment. Because there are times that it's done exceptionally well and is so healthy for development. And there are other times where they're trying to incorporate a lot of the time, these sensory through screens, which is that visual stimulation and music and rattling and all of this input. And what he was saying to me was, for them who are still building their auditory discrimination, I don't think they could hear me as I was in there trying to then provide language, and it almost became too much. And that's often an example that I provide to parents as well, to say sometimes that overstimulation can become a barrier to that connection opportunity.
Sarah, when you mentioned the overstimulation because all the sensory input, the way I describe it with my children specifically, they just become so infatuated, and I hate to use this term, but quite demonized by when they get off the screen. What's your advice on that, with how, I know obviously reducing screen time is one, but from an occupational therapy perspective, what's your take on that, and how can we reduce the impact after that excessive screen time?
Yeah, and I'm
many
sure
parents have the same difficulty too.
Yeah, can come in and talk about it as well. It's interesting because I'm a feeding therapist as well, and part of our welcome induction pack to parents is actually a handout on strategies on how to transition your child from using screen time during mealtime and things like that. I think, you're right in saying sometimes children can get fixated on screens, and then if we try to just remove that, really suddenly we get that really emotionally dysregulated response, which is those like meltdowns and that frustration. Often I think it's also important to keep in mind, like, what exactly are they watching? Because I find that that plays a very big role. If you're watching a show that is very overstimulating in terms of sounds, whether it's high frequency sounds that are really even like a lot of bombardment of different sounds and a lot of visual input, that is going to alert the child's sensory system and essentially bring their alertion level up, which is going to essentially start to make them be on that border of dysregulation. And then if you remove that suddenly, then we can get a little bit of that response. And I know a lot of families that have said, oh, I've changed to supporting my child in watching like low stimulation TV shows, which do exist. They're made for that purpose. And, it's made such a big difference with meltdowns and their emotional regulation. And it's because there's so much less stimulation, where we're not really built to have that much stimulation at once. I think if children are really into those really high stimulating shows and they find that that's what helps alert them, it's probably good to know what does calm them, because what can I combine with that to support them in calming their system down, and then slowly transitioning them off that show. And that can be use of other regulation tools. Maria, do you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think with screen time comes clear boundaries, and setting those clear boundaries from the get-go, no matter the age. So there will be times where parents are going to use it, and that's okay, as long as there's the expectation around how long, setting timers, perhaps, and Mary, you touched up on this, using those co-participating apps where parents are involved maybe towards the last 15 minutes as a transitional, before the transition, to then start the joint attention with the parent prior to coming off as well, and then transitioning into an activity with the parent before pulling it out, pulling it off them. So as long as the child is aware of the limitations, it should reduce the emotional dysregulation we see following. But also, as Sarah said, being mindful of what content that they are watching, and certain times of the day we don't want to be having very overstimulating, bright screen time prior to rest times. That's just going to alert and completely dysregulate the child prior to sleep or rest, and using more calming apps or shows or videos, through, depending on different parts of the day. I think we also need to be mindful of our own screen time use, and modeling what we want. If we're constantly on the phone and we're looking at our phone going, you put the iPad away, well, we've got to try our best to model and have parts of the day where we go screen time free.
It's like we need to set boundaries for the children, but also for ourselves as parents too.
Absolutely.
Now, Sarah and Marie, you mentioned about highly stimulating shows versus low stimulating shows. And now in my mind, Coco Melon for me is in that high range, and YouTube is in that high range. Now, with your professional perspective, could you list or give recommendation of what's a high stimulating resource or show versus a low stimulating show or
Well, technically Bluey is considered low stimulation. And the reason why it is if you think about the color scheme that is used, it's a lot of blue, it's a lot of soft yellows, a lot of oranges. So that's technically considered a low stimulation show. If you actually Google and write low stimulation TV shows and then you can put your child's age range, it will give you that variety of show options. But essentially, if you think about the types of shows that we would have watched as children, they were quite low stimulating in comparison to now. I think also thinking about, even when children are on YouTube, they have access to YouTube Shorts, which are really like kind of like TikTok and things like that, that have like really short shows and like, little videos and things. So they're getting so much frequent stimulation that is frequently changing. So they're not actually kind of sustaining a storyline that they can then communicate with their parent and have this like beautiful engagement opportunity, it tends to be these really fast-paced things that parents themselves are like, I'm so confused by this show. I don't even know what's happening myself. So if you're feeling that way about some of the shows, likely that's a really highly stimulating show. And it's probably better to try and reduce that if you can.
Yeah, so they're like the ones that you would find on YouTube or something that the child has access to it all the time, and they can just keep clicking and clicking to the next show or the next screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even thinking if it has music in the background that has that really fast, crescendo in the music, and it always feels like this suspense in those shows. I've watched a lot of children's shows that are like that. And even we need to think about visual over responsivity. I know for me, if I'm on a screen for too long, I'll feel nauseous. And there are a lot of children that will feel that way. And there's a lot of research that backs the fact that can then affect your feeding skills, because it can actually impact your appetite. So it's also, that's why the first thing we say is reducing the access to screen time during mealtime as feeding therapists, because we know that impacts their capacity to actually consume and enjoy their food.
And it's interesting you say that, because the quality of the language used in those highly sensitive, highly sensory shows, the quality is not the best. They would use quite inappropriate language or very vague, non-specific terms that will lead the child to not understand what the storyline is about. Whereas if we look at Bluey, whereas Bluey is quite detailed and descriptive, which is quite enriching for a child to learn off too. Jill, did you want to touch base on that?
Yeah, just everything. I just think that's so amazing, just how all of it comes down to the input, and knowing that if it's overfilled with other sensories, that there's not the room there for that language. And I remember a child psychologist, Vanessa Lapointe, and she's released quite a few books around child psychology, but she described it that when you give the child the screen with those highly sensory shows, it's like giving them the richest chocolate, most decadent dessert, and then you're saying, okay, now put that away, and here's your roast chicken and vegetables. And so what do? And so it's about being mindful of that, of like even the timing of when that's happening. Because I know even for us, sometimes when the clients come through the door and the child's really upset, and I'm sure it doesn't happen for OT, but it does for us, where they come and they're like, oh, we've got speech. And I was like, oh, what's going on? Oh, he's a bit upset because I pulled him off the iPad. And I was like, oh no. And in my head,
it happens in OT too.
All the time, guys. But I go, like, you gave them dessert before the vegetables, you know what I mean? So it's just being mindful of even, the timing, the overload. And the thing is, at the end of the day, we all just want what's best for our kids.
Yeah.
That's it. And our ability to, do certain things on certain days will fluctuate. We're all human. And I think that, like I said, from personal experience, there's a speechy hat and then there's a mum hat. And so, and for everybody else that's, on the call, we can all put our hand on our heart and say, yes, we've given our kids the screen when we've needed to before our own sanity. But when we do have more capacity, it is looking for, right, how can I get the most out of my interactions with the child? And play, at the end of the day, far trumps any type of low sensory show. It's the play, it's that, and it just touches on every single aspect of your child development, social, emotional, language, motor. It's just such this perfect all-in-one tool to give your child the absolute best that they can do. And I share the story because I like to say, I just had kids very young, but actually I am quite old. But my 19-year-old, we've always been a big play thing. And I think you're right. I think it was Maria, you said, pediatrics, like playing comes naturally to us. We're all very, we have that inner child that's thriving. But play was always a big focus at our house. And sometimes I found it easier to do than others. But I'm really proud of the fact that when my 19-year-old brought his new girlfriend over to meet the family, and the second sentence out of his mouth was, "Oh, what game will we play?"
Oh,
Yeah, and so we all sat around and played a game of Cluedo. But that's what, like, the sort of unwritten rule is, that's what we do in our house. We play. And so it's really comforting to see that. But please do not think that, I don't give my kids screen time. I make mistakes. We're all human, but it's just, when we have that capacity, just to be very conscious that, what we're saying yes to, we're saying no to something else. So saying yes to an easy fix to calm the kid right now in this moment, you're saying no then to possibly, that, 1,100 words, like, reading comprehension, emotional attachment, all of that kind of stuff that we really want for our babies.
and also school readiness. We forget that we need to set these children up with the foundations of learning to help them access the curriculum as best as they can once they start school too. Yeah. Carla, did you want to give us some of your tips in your work field, like how parents can play? Because we've touched base that parents sometimes struggle with play. How do you guide a parent with play in your field of work?
Yeah, so like I said before, I work closely with the 0 to 5s, and that first moment of the 0 to 3 years is probably the most crucial. Their brains are like sponges. Just simple activities, anything from making some Play-Doh together. People go to the shops and buy all these little colors. There's nothing like just getting some flour, talking about each step with your child. So it's a little bit of cooking, but yes, it's going to be an art activity at the end. Make the Play-Doh. If you can't make it, get some Play-Doh and just get any kitchen gadget. I'm sure we've got some plastic funnels, plastic plates, anything that's toddler safe, and just play with your child. Make some shapes, make some snakes, make the hissing sounds, all these things. Just like I said before, get on their level and just really engage and enjoy the experience. They're only young at such a young stage of their lives. I've got children who are older as well, just like Jules said. I've got a 20-year-old and 16-year-old, and in my house I was the same, always having simple play activities, and till this day they still love the games, the cards, things like that. So I think in those early years, just creating simple projects with your children, it's just amazing. Finger painting. You can even finger paint with yogurt. Why not? Or if you're cooking and you've got some leftover juice or something, that can be incorporated into the yogurt, and it's different colors. They're learning colors. Yeah, their hands are messy for a little bit. I'm not afraid of any messy play. That's what I do in most of my classes, but get a bit dirty, make it fun. I remember growing up at school, in primary school, I used to go play in mud in my school uniform. Like, there's no way anyone would do that these days, but I did back in the day. Actually probably wasn't even that dirty, but just all that manipulation is just all that bending and everything is just so good for holding pencil grip later. And I'm sure the OTs can vouch for that 100%. But yeah, just those, I say, just old-fashioned activities, there's just nothing like it. I could sit here all night listing so many art projects or cooking experiences or any sort of activity to get the children engaged. But I think it's really important. I know we're all busy. I run 2 businesses, so I'm busy myself, I know. But there's just nothing like just that quality time of just engaging through play. Yeah.
And I guess the idea of having a quality interaction
100%.
outweighs the quantity of all the toys that they have as well. The less, the more.
What about a good old-fashioned box, hey? Of all the activities and all the, what's those brands called? The Legos and everything. My kids just love the box, and getting some sticky tape and making a big fort. Getting the blankets. Endless hours of fun.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to pitch it to the other participants. If they have any questions that they would like to ask the speech team, the OT team, or even Dr. Mary, or even you, Carla, before we wrap up for the evening. But I wanted to ask Dr. Mary, we spoke a lot about behaviours of children after certain devices were removed. Did you experience that with some of the children on the study?
So within the study that was reported last week, we didn't get to explore that, but we have done some other work where we have tried to provide some resources with parents that can help them with their child under 2 years and their screen time. And as part of that project, we worked really closely with a group of parents, several different parents from across Australia, actually, to kind of understand what their challenges were and what their experiences were. And we heard that a lot from parents, is that sort of tantrum style behavior following removing the screen. And one of the things that we tried to recommend with that is one, I think Maria said it earlier, it's never too early to start setting those boundaries when it comes to screen time, and modeling that sort of behavior. Even if you think your child's too young, I guarantee they're not, and the earlier we can kind of set those boundaries, the better, because it does get harder as they get older to then kind of try and wind back. Not impossible, but if we can kind of get the parents starting really young, that's such a great thing. I think all the other suggestions that have been shared have been really fantastic. But one of the other things that we try to recommend, especially with very young kids, is, saying to them, "Oh, you have 15 minutes left on the screen," is not necessarily something that all kids will be able to comprehend. They're not quite at that stage yet where they, can tell time. So using things with the child's language that they might understand a bit better, like, okay, we're going to have one more episode and then we're going to move away from the screen, can be another, I guess, good tool for parents to have in their toolkit when trying to transition away from the screen. And just before I forget, I will add in some other recommendations that we've come across in our research. So I think on that, like, low stimulation kind of TV shows or more age appropriate shows, honestly, ABC Kids just still bring out, that was what I watched as a child, but they still just bring out some really fantastic content. And for very young kids, they have a whole section called, I think, Puggles, which is shows that are designed for very young kids. And, the great thing now is they have ABC iView. So I think a lot of parents tend to opt for things like YouTube because it seems very accessible and that there's always something on there. But when we have apps like iView and you can still access those things, I'd always recommend parents kind of choosing something like that rather than opting for YouTube, even YouTube Kids, because there's just so much content. There's all that autoplay stuff as well that, we can fall into the trap of and not necessarily always understand what your child is watching. And then again, it makes it harder for that transition afterwards too. I will give one plug and full disclosure. I have supported this group in the design of a campaign, but I'm based in South Australia, and just this week, the government has launched a new early years campaign. It's like a mass media campaign called Words Grow Minds. And I know not everyone is in South Australia, but essentially the campaign is just focused on promoting reading, playing, singing, and talking with their child. And so when I was hearing everyone say about, how parents really struggle to come up with ideas for play, if you do go on the Words Grow Mind website, I know that they have like lots and lots of great ideas for playing and talking and singing with children under the age of 3 specifically. So there's like a whole list there of ideas. So, anyone around Australia can access that. We're just fortunate in South Australia that we're also getting TV commercials and everything in our faces about it. But just another little idea for parents to go to if they are looking for ideas. It's a really great resource.
Congratulations on that. That's amazing. Let's hope New South Wales get that anytime soon.
That's awesome, because I'll just step in here. I've actually got a YouTube channel and I am growing content for children for 0 to 5 and then the 5 to 12s, but I'm also creating resources for the early learning childhood industry and for professionals. So yeah, maybe I can reach out to you, Mary, and we can have a little chat, and maybe we can create it in New South Wales. Hey, Rita?
Yeah, maybe. You can, I'll
There
be
you
Miss
go.
Sheena, you'll be Miss Carla.
That's it.
Test Miss Rachel. There's a few questions here that I'll read out. So firstly, there's a question from Rima. How do you think screen time in the younger years impacts students in the early years of primary school? So Jules, if you want to pitch in a speech point with me, we know if you have your go.
No, from my personal experience, I was again one of those ones that, you know, you've got all the answers before you have kids, and I was one of those parents like, you know, I'll never have a screen in the bedrooms. That's, you know, we know that kids need books before bed and all of that kind of thing. And then that was always the rule. But my husband's a chef, and so he was working every single night, and so I would be putting the kids to bed, and you put the first child down, you read him a story, tuck him in, awesome, go to the second child, read a story, tuck him in, go to the third child. So by the time I got to the third child, the first child was out of bed. Coming into the third child started having a fight with the first child, and I was, you know, and she's a ginger, so she's quite strong, you know, personality, bless her. And so I cannot get over with all the study and experience, and we know better, but at that time I thought it was a great idea. I'm just going to give her my phone and she can listen to at that time Frozen, and it worked. So like 2 minutes and my baby was you know, back in bed and asleep. And when I say baby, you know, she was 2. Anyway, so then the next night, of course, what do? First child, second child, third child, same thing again. She's out, give her the phone, she's asleep. That's great. Third night, it wasn't one song on YouTube. I, you know, put then the third child to bed, the fourth child to bed, went back to grab my phone. She's still watching the screen. And like, we know what blue screens do, but it's just that quick fix, right? Because that's at the end of the day what's going on. But I could not get over how quickly it went from quick fix to she's now wide awake, expecting to get Elsa every night. And it just went downhill so quickly. And it's just, again, pulling yourself in, because yes, I was, you know, giving her a phone, but worse than that, I was saying no to a book, right? We, you know, we're getting into that, as opposed to, how about here, read these books? And obviously she can't read, but kids feel like they're reading because they see us reading. Flick through those pages. It's okay if you're not asleep, but you need to stay in your bed, and here's some books. So what we do know is that kids need to have 1,000 books read to them before they're going to be able to read. So if we're replacing bedtime stories with quick, you know, screen activities, whatever it might be, we're actually delaying their acquisition of reading and spelling. And also what we also know is vocabulary is one of the big 6. So this is what we were talking about before, Dr. Mary, with your research about the quality of that interaction, that if we're not giving our children the quality interaction in that quality vocabulary and talking about it and describing textures and colors and everything, we're not exposing them to vocabulary, which is going to make reading and then spelling a lot harder. And that's all the way through. And vocabulary is so important. We can do an assessment as speech and language therapists. We can do an assessment at prep, which then gives us an indication of how they're going to be performing academically at year 12. Like, that's how causally related those two things are, because of the literacy and things like that. And so if it's a simple thing of, let's, you know, read storybooks, because the language and the vocabulary that we come across in books, we don't usually necessarily use in our everyday language. I don't think I've ever used the word meadow, but it comes up a bit when you're going through the, you know, the ladybug stories and stuff like that. So it's so important that we're very conscious of what that screen time is replacing and how quick it is for those habits to go out the window.
Jules, you touched lots about language and the importance of impact acquiring language skills, but I'm even thinking of the perspective of attention. Jules, Dr. Mary, your research really highlighted the child having reduced response time and reduced attention as well. So the impact for a child to respond to their name or even respond to a teacher in the classroom, I predict will be quite reduced as they get older, which will impact their ability to process information that the teacher's telling them, as well as responding to their peers and teachers and the staff are in the classroom too, which will ultimately impact their learning.
Yeah. Something I was just going to add was, so I work for I work as a consultant for the Department of Education. And so I work in different schools, but I work very closely with the department in like rolling out new systems and things into schools. And one of the biggest things that has been a really big topic of conversation in New South Wales is the social emotional impact of screen time. And something that we're finding is that a lot of young students, particularly in the early stages of primary school, are using screens as a form of regulation. So often parents will say, if they're having a meltdown, give them the iPad, that helps them calm down, and using that as a regulation tool. But you know, at school, we still have those rules of there's no screens on the playground, there's no screens in so many different parts of the school day, because they're trying to create this healthy balance of, you know, focusing on academics and not steering too far into providing too much access to screen time. And what they're finding as well is, because there was like a long period where smart boards were brought into every classroom, and then they started to realize that a lot of students were becoming dysregulated because of the screens. So then they were almost trying to get rid of it. But then, of course, with the issue of funding in schools and things, you want to use the funding you have. So there has been this challenge in that. And that's something that you'll notice the department starts to bring out things periodically throughout the year of, you know, new ways of working on social emotional learning, such as through the zones of regulation, focusing on social emotional well-being as opposed to focusing on behavior, looking at reducing screen time and building more group time, focusing on the group plan, focusing on even bringing outside providers into schools to work on, you know, regulation in PDHPE and those types of things. So those things, when they start to come out, is because of all of the concerns that the department has about those things. So,
and do you feel that's just an impact of screen time as well, since when they were younger as well?
Absolutely, because they're coming into school with this, I guess, reliance on it. And then often families are feeding that information to teachers as well, saying this is what regulates them. And then the teacher's sort of saying, well, I actually think it's doing the opposite. I think that's what's causing some of the dysregulation. And I think that's where there's sometimes that disconnect between families and with the teachers as well.
And it led to a question here that I'm quite interested in. Do you feel the impact of screens have led to incorrect diagnosis as a child gets older?
I think that, you know, it's hard for allied health professionals to say because we don't diagnose.
It's not necessarily like an actual disability, but like with a gross motor difficulty or
you know, I think a big thing that we talk about, like as OTs, I'm sure Maria would probably agree with me, is that often like we're seeing a lot of kids come through with gross motor delays. And a lot of the time there's evidence that keeps coming out saying, well, how much exposure are they having to the playground? How much exposure are they having to gross motor activities? If you think about the fact that they spend so much more time inside, so much more time with screens, also thinking about their visual motor skills that can be impacted by prolonged screen time as well. And you need your visual motor skills to catch a ball, throw a ball, kick a ball. So all of those skills as well can be impacted. And like you mentioned, even concentration and attention.
I can vouch. There's on my caseload now, I have many young children, even under the age of 2, with expressive language delay and a receptive language delay. And I feel a lot of it is associated with the lack of vocabulary exposure the child has exposure to. Jules, I'm sure you can relate to that too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's it. It just has a flow-on effect where it's nearly, you know, we're expecting the children to be having the same access to all of those different things, like throwing a ball and the reading books and all of that kind of thing, whereas it does kind of sometimes depend on their environment. And that's why we do things like this, isn't it? So that we can
increase exposure and awareness.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the questions that were asked. And I guess to summarize everything that was discussed today, we know we can't control screens as much as we can because they're always around, but we know we can definitely set up healthy boundaries and make better choices with the quality of the screen times, and always make the quality of the interaction the most important part. Picking more interactive moments and increasing play with your children. Did anyone want to add additional points before we wrap up this evening?
I'd like to have a little finishing little quote that a lot of OTs love, and it's by a lady called Karen Parvis, that it takes 400 repetitions for a synapse to be created in the brain, unless it's done through play, which then it takes 10 to 20 repetitions. So keeping in mind the power of play and adequate play then has that nice follow-on effect on all of the skills that we learn in early childhood.
Definitely. And if you're struggling to know how to play, just follow your child, follow what they're interested in, because if you show interest to what they're doing, they think, oh yeah, mum's cool, I'll do what she does too. And that's where imitation begins, turn taking, all those early language skills that are required to support the bigger picture.
We are the most valuable tool, resource, toy to our child, no matter the age. So therapeutic use of self in OT is huge, and the most underrated tool, but that's all you need, yourself.
Yourself, definitely. Carla, did you want to say anything before we finish up for the night?
I just want to share a quote. It's an African proverb. It takes a village to raise a child. And to have all of us on this panel tonight, I just want to say a big thank you, Rita, because together, this collaborative approach, we are helping so many families out there, and there's a bigger reach. So well done to reaching out to me last week, Rita. And I'm so glad I made this panel tonight. And so it really does take a village.
Thank you so much, Carla. And a big thank you to Dr. Mary for giving us your time and discussing your research in quite depth. It's definitely going to help my practice and how I communicate with parents about understanding the impact these screen times have, but knowing how to make a better choice around that too.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this and getting to chat with all of you today.
So
thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you all for the panel and giving me your time. It's been incredibly enriching, and I'm sure we've helped so many parents make better choices to support their child or their children's development, particularly with communication as well. I wish you all a wonderful evening, and thank you again, and I'll speak to you soon.